They said the weathered gray of my grandfather's boathouse, a structure that had stoically watched 70 summers fade across Whispering Pines Lake, was architecturally inconsistent with community standards. That was the first shot, a flimsy piece of paper tucked under the screen door, signed by a Mrs. Eleanor Ainsworth, president of the newly formed Whispering Pines Estates Homeowners Association. My grandfather, a man whose silence could command a room more effectively than most men's roars, simply read it, folded it precisely in half, and used it to level a wobbly leg on the porch table. He owned the porch, the table, the house, the land it sat on, and, as it happened, the entirety of Whispering Pines Lake, its bed, its banks, and every drop of water that fed the aquifer from which the brand new Whispering Pines Estates drew their precious, filtered sustenance. They just didn't know it yet. Or, rather, they'd forgotten. In their rush to gentrify history and homogenize charm into a palette of beige conformity, the initial volley was an annoyance, a gnat buzzing at the ear of a titan. We ignored it, assuming reason, or at least self-preservation, would prevail. My grandfather, Samuel, continued his morning ritual, coffee on the porch, watching the sun burn mist off the lake he'd bought with 50 years of sweat and shrewd foresight. A refuge carved out long before the first oversized luxury home had broken ground on the far shore, bristling with covenants and conditions. The lake was his sanctuary, and by extension, ours. My childhood was measured in summers spent there, learning to fish, to skip stones, to understand the quiet dignity of a man who spoke little but meant every syllable. The idea that some committee, spawned from suburban insecurity, could dictate terms on his legacy was laughable, almost. Then came the certified letter. The second letter was thicker, heavier, bearing the unmistakable scent of manufactured importance and cheap ink. Mrs. Ainsworth and her board had escalated. The boathouse was now subject to a daily fine. The ancient, perfectly functional wooden dock, grandfathered in by every conceivable local ordinance before the HOA even existed as a fever dream in some developer's spreadsheet, was apparently a navigational hazard and an eyesore. They cited rules that were younger than the paint on my car, rules applied retroactively with the casual arrogance of conquerors. My grandfather read this one too, his expression unchanging. He merely nodded, a slow, deliberate movement, and placed it beside the first. "They're making a list, Daniel," he said, his voice calm, a low rumble that vibrated with something I was only beginning to understand as controlled patience, the kind that precedes a tectonic shift. The fines accrued. More letters arrived, each more strident, more demanding. They photographed his fishing boat, deeming its faded blue hull unapproved. They complained about the smoke from his occasional evening fires in the stone pit by the water's edge, fires he'd enjoyed for half a century. This was not about a boathouse. This was about dominion. They wanted to break him, to make an example of the old man by the lake who refused to bend to their freshly minted authority. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. We consulted a local lawyer, a sleepy fellow named Herb, who'd known Samuel for decades. Herb just chuckled, adjusting his glasses. "Sam," he'd said, "you could buy and sell that entire HOA with what's in your left pocket. Why are we even entertaining this?" Grandfather's reply was quiet. "Principle, Herb, and a lesson in boundaries." The letters kept coming, the fines mounting with a kind of vicious glee. They were building their case, brick by bureaucratic brick, unaware the foundation they stood on was his. Then the bomb dropped, an 865-0 fine. It arrived via courier, a thick manila envelope that felt like it contained a lead weight. The consolidated penalties, they called it, for flagrant and continued disregard for community bylaws. It listed every perceived infraction, every day of noncompliance, inflated with late fees and administrative charges, dreamt up in some fevered power trip. $865,000 for living on his own land by his own lake as he had always done. My blood pressure spiked. I felt a tremor of rage, cold and sharp, run through me. This was an act of war. My grandfather, however, simply took the document, his gaze sweeping over the exorbitant figure. For the first time, I saw a flicker in his eyes, not of fear, but of something ancient and resolute. He set the demand down on the kitchen table, its official letterhead stark against the worn oak. He looked at me, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips, a smile that didn't reach his eyes, but settled in them like a patient predator. "Daniel," he said, his voice still impossibly calm, "go to the safe. Second shelf, green oilskin packet. Bring it here." I moved, a knot of fury and apprehension tightening in my chest. The green oilskin packet was heavy, tied with faded twine. Inside, nestled amongst other yellowed papers, were the original deeds to the entirety of Whispering Pines Lake, meticulously outlining its metes and bounds, and a separate, equally ancient document, a water rights agreement, a compact so old it predated most of the county's current zoning laws, granting him exclusive control over the lake's outflow and, by critical extension, the primary recharge source for the aquifer serving the entire Whispering Pines estates. They were fining the man who owned their water. The sheer, monumental, almost comedic stupidity of it was a physical blow. My grandfather spread the documents on the table. The old survey maps, the deeds stamped with official seals from a bygone era, the water compact signed by names long turned to dust. It was a fortress of legal precedent, unassailable. "They draw their water," he stated, not asked, tapping a precise point on the map, indicating the HOA's primary well and its proximity to the lake's subterranean outflow, from an aquifer fed almost exclusively by this lake. His finger, gnarled but steady, traced the hydrological connections. "A private lake." My private lake. The calm in his voice was more terrifying than any shout. It was the calm of absolute certainty, of power held in reserve, now reluctantly brought to bear. "Herb will know what to do with these," he continued. "But first, we send Mrs. Ainsworth a little correspondence of our own. He wasn't just going to defend, he was going on the offensive." The legally lethal aspect of his personality, usually dormant beneath layers of quiet dignity, was now fully awake. We spent the afternoon drafting a letter. Not a plea, not a negotiation. It was a notification. A polite, surgically precise, utterly damning recitation of facts. It detailed his undisputed ownership of the lake, referenced the enclosed copies of the deeds and water compact, and then, with chilling courtesy, informed the Whispering Pines Estates HOA that their continued, unlicensed drawing of water from the aquifer fed by his private property constituted an ongoing trespass and unauthorized use of private resources. It concluded by stating that, unless all fines were rescinded, all harassing communications ceased, and a formal public apology was issued within 10 business days. He would be forced to take immediate legal action to protect his property rights, including, but not limited to, seeking injunctive relief to halt their water withdrawal and pursuing damages for past unauthorized use. The air in the room crackled. This wasn't just turning the tables, it was flipping the entire game board into their faces. "We sent our letter via certified mail," return receipt requested, with copies to Herb and the County Water Resource Board for good measure, a subtle application of federal gravitas. As the county had long ago acknowledged Samuel's historic water rights, in their master plan. The 10 days that followed were a study in suspended animation. The HOA's daily fine notices abruptly stopped. There was a silence from their end, a heavy, loaded silence that spoke volumes. I imagined Mrs. Ainsworth and her board huddled around our letter, the color draining from their faces as the implications of those old deeds and water compacts sank in. The arrogance would be fighting a losing battle against dawning panic. Did they even have a lawyer competent enough to understand the depth of their predicament? Or had their entire legal budget been blown on drafting those ridiculous fine notices? My grandfather remained serene. He fished. He tended his small garden. He drank his coffee on the porch. But there was a new alertness in his eyes, a keen edge. He was waiting. On the 8th day, a car I didn't recognize, something sleek and expensive that screamed billable hours, pulled into our long driveway. A man in a suit, too sharp for the rustic setting, emerged, carrying a slim briefcase. He introduced himself as Mr. Alistair Finch, legal counsel for the Whispering Pines Estates, HOA. He was all polished professionalism, but his eyes had the hunted look of a man handed an impossible brief. He requested a meeting with my grandfather. Samuel agreed, inviting him onto the porch, the very porch that had been a subject of their petty complaints. The irony was thick enough to spread on toast. Mr. Finch, to his credit, didn't bluster. He was clearly out of his depth, or rather, his clients were. He attempted a conciliatory tone, speaking of misunderstandings and finding common ground. Mr. Finch began by acknowledging receipt of our correspondence. He used phrases like complex historical claims and unforeseen entanglements, carefully avoiding any admission of fault or, more importantly, the catastrophic reality of their situation. My grandfather listened, impassive, occasionally sipping his coffee. The sun was high, glinting off the lake, his lake, and the silence between Finch's carefully constructed sentences stretched, taut, and uncomfortable for the lawyer. Mr. Hayes, Finch began, trying for a tone of mutual reasonableness. The HOA board was unaware of the full extent of these historical claims regarding the lake itself. Our primary concern has always been the aesthetic harmony and property values within Whispering Pines Estates. My grandfather's reply was a single soft word. Indeed, Finch pressed on. We are, of course, prepared to discuss the outstanding fines. Perhaps a significant reduction, a mutual agreement to. Samuel cut him off, not rudely, but with an air of finality that brooked no argument. There is nothing to discuss regarding the fines, Mr. Finch. They are null. They are an insult. They will be rescinded in their entirety. He paused, letting the statement hang in the air. And the public apology? I added, my voice harder than I intended. The controlled fury my grandfather modeled so well now my own. Finch's professional veneer cracked slightly. An apology is a strong measure, the board feels. My grandfather raised a hand. A small, almost imperceptible gesture, yet it silenced Finch instantly. The board feels, Samuel said, his voice like chilled steel, that they can dictate terms on land that isn't theirs, regarding water they don't own. The board is mistaken. He leaned forward, just an inch. 10 days, Mr. Finch. That was the time frame. 2 remain. Finch's composure was visibly fraying. My clients are reviewing their options. They believe there may be alternative interpretations of the audacity. Even cornered, they still thought they could haggle with the man who held their lifeline. The only interpretation, Samuel stated, is that the water they are currently pumping, the water that fills their pools, waters their manicured lawns, and flows from their kitchen taps, originates from my property, unauthorized, for years. The unspoken threat of back charges, of a lawsuit that would bankrupt their precious HOA, hung heavy. Finch swallowed. We are prepared to make a substantial offer to secure future water access. A licensing agreement, perhaps. First, I interjected, unable to hold back a sliver of bitingly sarcastic pleasure. You drop the $865 fine for the privilege of my grandfather looking at his own lake. Then, you apologize for the harassment. Then, and only then, might he consider discussing the terms under which he allows your clients to continue to exist as a hydrated community. The color drained further from Finch's face. He knew. He knew the game was over. The remaining 2 days passed. No apology, no formal rescission of fines, just silence. On the morning of the 11th day, my grandfather made a single phone call to Herb. Herb, he said, proceed. The legal machinery, primed and waiting, began to turn. Herb filed for an immediate injunction in county court to halt the Whispering Pines estates, HOA's unauthorized withdrawal of water from the aquifer, citing irreparable harm to my grandfather's private property rights and the potential for depletion of his private water source. The filing included copies of the deeds, the water compact, and a sworn affidavit from a hydrologist confirming the direct link between the lake and the HOA's wells. Simultaneously, a demand letter for retroactive compensation for years of unauthorized water use was dispatched to the HOA, the figure calculated by Herb making the $865 fine look like pocket change. It was, as Herb gleefully put it, a legally surgical evisceration. The court, faced with unequivocal proof of ownership and long-standing water rights, granted a temporary restraining order within 48 hours. The order was simple. The Whispering Pines Estates HOA was to immediately cease and desist all water pumping operations from the specified wells until a further hearing. A sheriff's deputy served the order directly to Mrs. Ainsworth at the HOA's little rented office in a strip mall. I would have paid good money to see her face. The news spread through Whispering Pines Estates like a flash flood. First confusion, then disbelief, then outright panic. Taps running dry, irrigation systems sputtering to a halt, toilets refusing to flush. The carefully curated illusion of their idyllic suburban enclave shattered by the sudden stark reality of their dependence. Their federal gravitas was non-existent, their local clout a mirage. The calls started flooding the HOA office, then my grandfather's number, which they'd ironically listed in their directory as an adjacent property owner. He didn't answer. He was on his porch, drinking coffee, watching the lake. The peace was profound. The HOA emergency board meeting was chaos. We didn't attend, but reports trickled back through a few of the less arrogant residents, individuals who had always been uncomfortable with Ainsworth's tyrannical reign and now saw their property values and daily lives circling the drain. Ainsworth apparently tried to bluster, to blame my grandfather, to accuse him of environmental terrorism. But the facts, presented by a hastily hired and visibly stressed new lawyer specializing in water rights, Finch, having apparently recused himself or been fired, were undeniable. The deeds were real. The water compact was ironclad. They had built their castle on Samuel's land, metaphorically speaking, and were now drinking his water without permission. The residents, initially furious at the inconvenience, quickly turned their sights on the true culprits. Ainsworth and her compliant board, who had led them into this disaster through sheer arrogance and incompetence. The questions were brutal. Why didn't you know he owned the lake? Who authorized these insane fines? How could you jeopardize our water supply over a boathouse color? The systemic humiliation was glorious to behold, even secondhand. Ainsworth's explanations were flimsy, her authority evaporated. The carefully constructed facade of the all-powerful HOA president crumbled under the weight of actual, tangible consequences. They had tried to inflate a petty grievance into an 865-0 cudgel and had instead brought a guillotine down on their own necks. The sheer situational irony was a humor so dark it was almost sublime. One resident, an elderly woman named Mrs. Gable, whose prize-winning roses were already wilting, reportedly stood up and said, "Eleanor, you picked a fight with the one man who could literally turn off our lights, or in this case, our taps. For what? So his dock wouldn't offend your sensibilities?" The room, apparently, fell into a stunned silence, then erupted into demands for the board's immediate resignation. The resignations came swiftly. Ainsworth, her vice president, and the treasurer all stepped down within 24 hours of the emergency meeting, their petty tyranny ending not with a bang, but with the gurgle of dry pipes. A new, interim board was hastily formed, comprised of shell-shocked residents whose primary qualification was not having been on the previous board. Their first official act was to dispatch a profusely apologetic delegation to my grandfather's lakehouse. Not lawyers this time, but 3 homeowners, a retired engineer, a doctor, and Mrs. Gable herself. They stood on his porch, hats figuratively in hand, the afternoon sun casting long shadows. There was no arrogance left, only a desperate plea for negotiation. My grandfather listened, his expression unreadable. Mrs. Gable spoke first, her voice trembling slightly. "Mr. Hayes," she said, "we are so terribly sorry. For the fines, for the harassment, for the sheer stupidity of it all." Eleanor Ainsworth does not speak for all of us, though we allowed her to for too long. The engineer outlined their immediate crisis: no water, plummeting property values, potential sanitation issues. The doctor spoke of health concerns. They didn't make excuses. They simply laid out the disaster. They formally, and in writing, rescinded every fine, every violation, every complaint ever issued against my grandfather. They offered a public apology to be printed in the local paper and on their community website. And then they asked, humbly, if he would consider allowing them to negotiate a fair licensing agreement for water access. My grandfather was silent for a long moment, looking out over his lake. The only sounds were the gentle lapping of water against the shore and the distant call of a loon. Finally, he nodded once. "Herb will be in touch with your council to discuss terms," he said. "The terms will be fair, but they will reflect the true value of what you are taking for granted." The relief on their faces was palpable. Justice, in this case, wasn't just about punishment. It was about restoring balance, about teaching a profound lesson in respect and boundaries. The hard-earned peace began to settle. The negotiations for the water licensing agreement were swift and, as my grandfather promised, fair but not cheap. The HOA, now under new humbled leadership, readily agreed to terms that not only compensated Samuel for future water use, but also included a significant contribution to a local watershed preservation fund he designated. The days of the Whispering Pines Estates HOA acting like feudal lords were decisively over. The boathouse remained its weathered gray. The dock stayed put. My grandfather continued to enjoy his evening fires. The only thing that changed was the profound, almost reverential respect he now received from the residents on the far shore. They'd learned, the hard way, that the quiet old man by the lake held more power in his worn leather briefcase than their entire book of bylaws. The public apology, when it was printed, was unequivocal. Mrs. Ainsworth quietly sold her house and moved away, her reign of suburban terror a mere footnote in the lake's long history. Sometimes I'd see Mrs. Gable tending her now flourishing roses, and she'd give a small, respectful wave towards my grandfather's porch, The destroyed HOA sign, metaphorically speaking, was their arrogance, now shattered. The sunlight on the cabin, on the lake, felt cleaner, brighter. My grandfather never gloated. He never mentioned the 865-0 fine again. He simply resumed his life, the lake his constant companion. One morning, months later, as we sat on the porch sharing coffee, the mist rising just as it always had, he looked out at the water. "People forget," he said, his voice a low murmur, "that some things, old things, have deep roots, and you don't tug on those unless you're prepared for what comes out of the ground with them." It was the closest he ever came to summarizing the affair. The peace was real, bought with resolve, and the quiet assertion of undeniable truth. The lake remained, a testament to his foresight, a sanctuary preserved not by fences or signs, but by the unshakable bedrock of ownership and the calm, dangerous, righteous assertion of rights long established.